I never believed in ghosts until that night in the library. I was 17, studying for finals, absolutely convinced that supernatural stories were just entertainment for people who needed something to believe in. My worldview was clean, rational, ordered. The universe operated on principles I could understand. Death was an ending, not a doorway. But some experiences crack open your certainty like an eggshell, and what happened to me that October rewrote everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between life and whatever comes after. Our school had extended library hours during exam season. Most students would leave by 8 or 9, but I liked staying later. There was something about the deep silence after everyone else had gone, the way the building settled into itself, that helped me concentrate. My parents didn't mind because we lived close enough that the walk home took maybe 15 minutes. I'd done it dozens of times in the dark. The route was familiar, almost meditative. Down the long corridor from the library, right turn at the end, through the front doors, then 3 blocks through a neighborhood I'd known my entire life. That particular night, I'd lost track of time completely. When I finally looked up from my chemistry textbook, the clock above the circulation desk read 10 past 10. The library felt different at that hour. Not threatening exactly, but aware. Like the building itself was watching me, waiting to see what I would do now that I was alone in its depths. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency I'd never noticed before. The shadows between the stacks seemed darker, more substantial, as though they had weight and texture. I should have felt more concerned about the time, but I was close to finishing a particularly difficult chapter. Just 10 more minutes, I told myself. Maybe 15. Then I'd pack up and head home. I bent back over my notes, determined to push through to the end of the section. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Uneven. Dragging. The distinctive rhythm of someone limping, moving through the library with slow, painful determination. My first thought was that another student had stayed late and injured themselves somehow. Maybe they'd fallen asleep and were now disoriented, stumbling between the shelves. But something about the sound made my skin prickle. The pace was too deliberate, too measured. This wasn't someone hurt and confused. This was someone searching. The footsteps grew closer, moving through the aisles with purpose, and suddenly I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't want to see who was making that sound. I didn't want to turn around and find out what was limping toward me through the empty library at 10 o'clock at night. I grabbed my books without organizing them, stuffed everything into my bag in a graceless heap, and moved toward the exit as quickly as I could without running. My hands were shaking. I felt ridiculous, like a child fleeing from imaginary monsters, but I couldn't shake the visceral wrongness of those footsteps. They seemed to echo from everywhere at once, surrounding me, closing in from all directions. I pushed through the library doors and entered the corridor that led to the school's front entrance. The corridor stretched ahead of me, longer than I remembered. The exit door seemed impossibly far away, as though the building had stretched itself while I wasn't looking. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows that made the hallway feel narrower, more claustrophobic. I walked quickly, my footsteps too loud in the silence, echoing off the walls. About halfway down the corridor, I saw her. A woman standing at the far end, silhouetted against the exit door. She was perfectly still, waiting. I slowed down, suddenly uncertain. I didn't recognize her. She wasn't a teacher or a janitor or anyone I'd seen around the school before. As I got closer, the wrongness intensified. She wasn't just standing there. She was positioned there, like she'd been placed specifically to block my path. My throat tightened. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I called out, trying to make my voice sound normal, confident. "Who's there?" The question hung in the empty corridor for a moment, and then she was gone. Not walking away, not moving out of sight. Just gone. Vanished between one heartbeat and the next. I stood frozen, my brain trying to process what I'd just seen. People don't disappear. They turn corners, they step into shadows, but they don't simply cease to exist in front of your eyes. I waited for some rational explanation to present itself, but none came. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, I forced myself to keep moving toward the exit. My legs felt disconnected from my body, like I was operating them through remote control. I pushed through the front doors and stepped out into the night. The street was wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. Our neighborhood was never empty. Even late at night, there were always people coming home from work, walking dogs, heading to the convenience store. Cars passed regularly, their headlights sweeping across the buildings. But tonight, the street was deserted. No people, no cars, no movement anywhere. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light onto empty sidewalks. The silence was absolute, oppressive, like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. I started walking home, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground. Looking up felt dangerous somehow, like I might see something I couldn't unsee. My exhaustion made everything feel surreal, dreamlike. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in the library, I thought. Maybe this was a stress dream brought on by too much studying and not enough sleep. But the pavement under my feet felt solid. The cold night air bit at my exposed skin. The weight of my backpack pulled at my shoulders. Everything felt real. That's when I noticed the shadow. It stretched out ahead of me on the pavement, long and distorted in the streetlight. But it wasn't my shadow. Mine was behind me, cast by a streetlight at my back. This shadow belonged to someone walking in front of me, someone I couldn't see. I stopped walking. The shadow stopped too. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Slowly, reluctantly, I raised my eyes from the ground. She was there, about 15 feet ahead of me. The same woman from the corridor, except now I could see her clearly. She walked with a severe limp, her entire body twisted as though she'd been broken and healed wrong. Her clothes hung in tatters, grey and stained with things I didn't want to identify. Her hair was a matted nest, falling across a face I couldn't quite make out. She moved slowly, painfully, but with absolute determination. Each step seemed to cost her tremendous effort, and yet she never stopped. I stood completely still, afraid that any movement would draw her attention. But I was walking faster than she could manage, and despite my paralysis, the distance between us closed. She was limping so slowly that I caught up to her without meaning to, until I was close enough to hear the dragging scrape of her twisted foot against the pavement, close enough to smell something rotten and organic that clung to her like perfume. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back the way I'd come, but I was too terrified to move. My body had betrayed me, locking me in place while my mind shrieked warnings I couldn't act on. We were on my street now. My house was visible ahead, the familiar porch light burning like a beacon. I could make it, I thought. Just push past her and run for the door. But I couldn't make myself move closer to her. Couldn't force my legs to carry me into that zone of wrongness that surrounded her like a field. I stood there, frozen, while she continued her slow, agonizing progress down the empty street. Then she turned around. The movement was too fast, too fluid for someone who'd been limping so badly a moment before. She faced me directly, and I finally saw her completely. Her face was wrong. Not just damaged or diseased, but fundamentally incorrect, like someone had taken a photograph of a face and distorted it until the features no longer aligned properly. Her mouth moved, forming words that took several seconds to reach my ears, as though sound itself was struggling to escape from whatever space she occupied. "Have you seen my daughter?" The question was simple, almost banal, but the voice that asked it was layered with something else. Grief so profound it had curdled into madness, obsession that had outlasted death itself. She asked the question like she'd asked it 10,000 times before, like she'd been asking it for years, decades, asking it of every person unlucky enough to cross her path in the dead hours of the night. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. My brain had shut down all non-essential functions, including the ability to form language. I stood there with my mouth open, making no sound, while she waited for an answer with inhuman patience. Her eyes were fixed on me, and there was something predatory in that gaze, something that suggested the wrong answer would have consequences I couldn't imagine. Terror overrode my paralysis. I raised one arm and pointed away down the street, as far as I could reach, indicating some vague and distant location. "Over there," I managed to whisper. "Far away. That direction." She didn't question it, didn't ask for clarification or express doubt. She simply turned and began limping away in the direction I'd pointed, moving with that same painful determination, gradually disappearing into the darkness. I ran, not toward my house, even though it was right there, so close I could have made it in 30 seconds. I ran in the opposite direction, away from her, away from my home, away from everything familiar. I ran because staying on that street felt like suicide, like waiting for something terrible to finish what it had started. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out. But I kept running, looking for another person, a car, a lit window, anything that would prove the world still existed beyond this nightmare pocket I'd fallen into. That's when I heard her scream. The sound came from far away, from the direction where I'd sent her, and it was filled with rage and triumph and sick joy all braided together. "She's here." The words echoed through the empty streets, bouncing off buildings, multiplying until they seemed to come from everywhere at once. "She's here, she's here, she's here." After that, everything goes dark. I have no memory of what happened next. My mind has locked away whatever occurred in the blank space between that scream and waking up. My neighbor found me the next morning, unconscious on the sidewalk 3 blocks from my house. He carried me home and called my parents, who rushed me to the hospital. The doctors found nothing wrong. No injuries, no obvious trauma, no medical explanation for why I'd lost consciousness. Just a gap in my memory and a terror I couldn't explain. It was my neighbor who told me the story later, after I'd been released from the hospital, after my parents stopped hovering quite so intensely. He came by the house one evening and asked if he could talk to me. We sat on the porch while the sun set, and he told me about Agatha, about the woman who'd lost everything 25 years earlier in a tragedy that had marked our neighborhood like a scar that never quite healed. In 1998, Agatha had been a single mother living 2 streets over from where we sat. Her daughter had been 10 years old, a student at Eden Hill Elementary School, which fed into the middle school and high school I attended. The daughter had been playing with friends one afternoon when the accident happened. The details were unclear, my neighbor said. Different people told different versions. Some said she'd fallen from playground equipment. Others claimed she'd been hit by a car that didn't stop. A few insisted there had been something darker involved, something the school had covered up to avoid liability. But everyone agreed on the outcome. The daughter had died, and Agatha had shattered. The mother couldn't accept it, my neighbor explained. Couldn't process the reality of her child's death. She spent days, then weeks, then months searching for her daughter, convinced that there had been a mistake, that her child was lost somewhere and would come home if Agatha just kept looking. She walked the streets at all hours, knocking on doors, stopping strangers, showing them a photograph worn soft from constant handling. "Have you seen my daughter?" she would ask, her voice growing more desperate with each passing day. The neighborhood tried to help at first. People brought her meals, offered condolences, suggested grief counseling, but Agatha refused all assistance. She insisted that her daughter was alive, that everyone else was wrong, that she would find her if she just searched hard enough. The school district assigned a social worker. The police did welfare checks. Friends and relatives attempted interventions. Nothing worked. Agatha's search continued, growing more frantic and disordered as the months passed. Then one night, about a year after the daughter's death, Agatha disappeared. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody knew where she went. The house stood empty for weeks before the landlord finally entered and found it abandoned. Agatha's belongings were still there, her clothes still hung in the closet, food still sat in the refrigerator. But Agatha herself was gone, as completely as though she'd never existed. For a while, people assumed she'd left town, unable to bear living in a place that reminded her of what she'd lost. But then the sightings began. Students leaving late from school activities would glimpse a limping figure in the corridors. People walking through the neighborhood at night would see a woman standing at the end of their street, watching them with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. And sometimes, if you were unlucky enough to cross her path in the deep hours of the night, she would ask you the question she'd been asking for 25 years. "Have you seen my daughter?" My neighbor said he'd seen her himself twice. Once when he was in college, walking home late from a party. Once when he was 40, coming back from a night shift. Both times, she'd asked the question. Both times, he'd pointed her away and watched her limp off into the darkness. He'd learned not to engage, not to try reasoning with her. You just pointed somewhere far away and hoped she would go look there for a while. "Why does she scream like that?" I asked him. "When she thinks she's found her daughter, why does she sound so angry?" He was quiet for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker on as the sky darkened. "I don't think it's anger," he said finally. "I think it's recognition. After all those years of searching, of asking the same question over and over, she finally got an answer. She finally found her daughter. Or at least, she thinks she did." He paused, then added, softly, "The tragedy is that she's been finding her daughter every few months for the past 25 years. Different person every time. But in her mind, each one is real. Each one is the child she's been searching for. And the joy of that recognition, the relief and triumph, that's what makes her scream like that." I thought about this for a while. "But why me? Why that night?" "No reason," he said. "Just chance. Wrong place, wrong time. She walks those streets every night, asking her question to anyone she encounters. You happened to be there when she was." He stood up to leave, then turned back. "The school knows about her. The old-timers, anyway. That's why they started closing the library earlier, why they discourage students from staying late. It's not about the exams. It's about making sure kids leave before dark, before the hours when Agatha walks." After he left, I sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about a grief so powerful it had outlasted death itself. Thinking about a mother so devoted to finding her lost child that she'd continued the search even after her own life ended. There was something almost beautiful about it, in a terrible way. Love that refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational choice. But there was horror in it too, because what my neighbor had described wasn't love anymore, not really. It was the shell of love, the empty ritual of devotion that had forgotten its purpose. Agatha wasn't searching for her daughter anymore. She was performing the search, acting out a script she'd internalized so deeply that death couldn't interrupt it. The daughter she was looking for didn't exist, had never existed except as a memory, and yet Agatha would keep searching forever, keep asking her question to every stranger, unlucky enough to cross her path, keep experiencing that moment of false recognition and terrible joy. I started having nightmares after that, not about Agatha specifically, but about the idea she represented. I would dream I was searching for something I'd lost, something precious and irreplaceable. In the dreams, I would search for years, decades, centuries, long after everyone I knew had died and the world had moved on without me. But I couldn't stop. I had forgotten why I was searching, forgotten even what I was looking for, but the search itself had become my entire existence. I would wake up feeling exhausted and hollow, as though I really had been searching all night. The school library changed its hours after that semester. They went back to closing at 8, citing budget constraints and lack of student interest. But I knew the real reason. Someone had reported a student collapsing on the street after a late-night study session. Someone had connected the dots and decided the risk wasn't worth it. Better to limit the hours than to keep putting students in Agatha's path during her nightly walks. I never studied late again. Couldn't bring myself to stay in that building past sunset. Couldn't walk those corridors without remembering the figure at the end of the hallway, there and then gone. Even during the day, the library felt different to me. Haunted, though not by Agatha herself. Haunted by the knowledge that grief could do this, could hollow out a person so completely that they became a walking wound, a question with no answer, searching eternally for something that could never be found. My parents wanted me to see a therapist after the incident. They were worried about the memory gap, the fact that I couldn't account for several hours of that night. But I refused. What could I tell a therapist? That I'd seen a ghost? That I'd encountered a dead woman's grief made manifest? They would think I was having a breakdown, prescribe medication, try to convince me that exhaustion and stress had created a hallucination. But I knew what I'd experienced. The memory of Agatha's face, of her voice asking that terrible question, of her scream when she thought she'd found her daughter, all of it was too sharp, too real to be dismissed as a stress-induced delusion. I started researching ghosts after that. Not for entertainment, but for understanding. I needed to know if what happened to me happened to others, if there were patterns I could recognize, rules I could learn. What I found was a catalogue of similar stories stretching back centuries. The woman in white searching for her lost children. The hitchhiker who vanishes from moving cars. The figure that appears at crossroads, asking questions that have no good answers. All of them variations on a theme, all of them suggesting that some kinds of sorrow create permanent scars on the world itself. Most of the stories involved unfinished business. A task left incomplete. A wrong that needed righting. A message that had to be delivered. But Agatha's story was different. Her business couldn't be finished. Her daughter was dead, had been dead for a quarter century. There was no resolution possible, no way for her to accomplish her goal and move on. She was trapped in an impossible loop, searching for something she would never find, or finding it over and over in the faces of strangers who weren't her child. I wondered sometimes what would happen if I tried to talk to her. If I encountered her again and tried to explain that her daughter was gone, that she'd been gone for 25 years, that the search was pointless. But I suspected it wouldn't work. The Agatha who walked those streets wasn't capable of hearing that message anymore. She'd armored herself against that truth so completely that it couldn't reach her. Maybe that was the real horror, I thought. Not that she was trapped searching, but that the armor she'd built to protect herself from grief had become her prison. There's a philosophical concept I learned about later in university. The idea that we're all ship of thesis problems, constantly replacing parts of ourselves until eventually none of the original components remain, until the person we were has been completely replaced by the person we've become. I think about that in relation to Agatha sometimes. She'd held on to one part of herself so tightly, her identity as a mother searching for her lost child, that it had consumed everything else. The Agatha who died was no longer the Agatha who'd given birth to that child. She'd been replaced, piece by piece, by grief and obsession until nothing else remained. My neighbor told me that sightings of Agatha had decreased over the years. The older generation knew her story, but younger people had never heard of her. The school district had largely turned over, new teachers and administrators replacing the ones who remembered when it happened. Soon, he said, there might not be anyone left who knew who Agatha was or why she walked those streets asking her question. She would become just another neighborhood ghost story, a scary tale to tell at sleepovers, with no connection to the real tragedy that had created her. I think about that sometimes, about being forgotten. about existing as a story that gets simpler and less accurate with each retelling until finally it disappears, completely because no one remembers it well enough to pass it on. It seems cruel somehow that Agatha's grief and devotion might be reduced to a campfire story, then to a vague urban legend, then to nothing at all. But maybe that's a kind of mercy too. Maybe being forgotten is the only real rest available to those who can't let go. I graduated from Eden Hill School 2 years after the incident in the library. I went to university in another city, found a career, built a life far away from that neighborhood. I haven't been back in nearly a decade. My parents moved away shortly after I graduated, retiring to a warmer climate, so there's no reason to return. But I think about it sometimes. I think about those empty streets at midnight, about the corridor stretching endlessly toward the exit, about a woman with a twisted body and broken mind asking a question she's been asking for 25 years. I wonder if she's still walking, if students at Eden Hill still occasionally see her limping through the corridors or standing at the end of their street. If anyone still knows her story, or if she's become anonymous, a nameless presence that frightens people without them understanding why. I wonder if she still experiences that moment of false recognition, that terrible joy when she thinks she's finally found her daughter. I wonder if that joy makes the eternal search worthwhile, or if it's just another layer of cruelty in a situation that's already unbearably cruel. Sometimes I dream that I'm back on that street, back in that moment when she turned around and asked me her question. But in the dreams, I answer differently. I tell her the truth. I say, your daughter is gone. She died 25 years ago. You've been searching for something that isn't there. And in the dreams, she hears me. The recognition dawns in her distorted face. She understands, finally, completely. And then she vanishes, not with the sudden absence of before, but gradually, like fog burning away in sunlight. She fades and fades until nothing remains but empty street and ordinary darkness. But I know that's just wishful thinking. The real Agatha can't be saved with words or truth or compassion. She's locked in her pattern too completely. The grief that created her is too old, too hardened, too fundamental to what she is. She'll keep walking those streets, keep asking her question, keep experiencing her moments of false joy, until finally the last person who remembers her dies and she fades from collective memory. And maybe that's the closest thing to peace she'll ever find. What happened to me that night changed how I understand the world. Not in some dramatic, life-altering way, but subtly, like adjusting a lens to bring things into sharper focus. I know now that the boundaries between life and death aren't as solid as I thought. That emotions can be strong enough to outlast the people who felt them. That love and grief, pushed far enough, can become indistinguishable from each other. That some questions have no good answers, and asking them anyway is its own kind of torment. I don't tell this story often. Most people don't want to hear it, don't want to consider the implications. They prefer to keep death neat and tidy, a door that only swings one way. And maybe they're right to want that. Maybe it's healthier to believe in clear boundaries, in finality, in the impossibility of encountering someone who should no longer exist. But I can't return to that simple certainty. I've seen what grief can do when it refuses to let go. I've heard the question that has no answer. I've witnessed love that outlasted life itself, and learned that sometimes the things we think of as beautiful are actually horrifying, and the things that terrify us might contain a strange, terrible beauty. If you ever find yourself walking through an empty neighborhood late at night, and you see a limping figure ahead of you in the darkness, I have only one piece of advice. If she turns around and asks you her question, don't try to help. Don't try to explain. Don't try to give her closure. Just point somewhere far away, watch her limp off into the darkness, and be grateful that you're not the one who's been searching for 25 years with no hope of ever finding what you're looking for.